The summer of 1885 scorched the plains of Wyoming Territory with unforgiving heat. But Hannah Lawson felt a different kind of burning as she collapsed against the weathered porch post of her family's homestead. The flames that had consumed everything she loved: her parents, their modest home, the life they had painstakingly built, still flickered in her mind's eye as she stared at the smoldering ruins before her, her throat raw and useless from hours of desperate screaming. Hannah had been in town when it happened, purchasing supplies for the coming winter months. The distant plume of black smoke had sent her racing back, the borrowed horse from the general store pushed to its limits. By the time she arrived, it was too late. Nothing remained but ash, charred wood, and the overwhelming silence of absolute loss. Night fell, and still she hadn't moved. Her voice had given out hours ago, her screams dissolving into silent, body-racking sobs. The occasional creak of settling embers was the only sound across the moonlit prairie. Hannah didn't hear the approach of horse hooves until they were nearly upon her, a tall figure dismounted, boots crunching on the hard-packed earth. He paused at the edge of what had once been the front yard, hat in hand, taking in the devastation with eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. "Miss," the deep voice startled her. "Are you hurt?" Hannah tried to answer, but her voice produced nothing but a painful rasp of air. She clutched at her throat, eyes wide and desperate to communicate. The stranger approached slowly, as one might a wounded animal. The moonlight revealed a weathered face beneath the brim of his Stetson, not young, but not old either. Perhaps 30 or so, with eyes the color of the sky before a storm and a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble. "My name's Daniel Yates," he said softly. "I was riding to Sweetwater when I saw the smoke." He crouched before her, keeping a respectful distance. "Your voice gone from all the crying," Hannah nodded, tears streaming anew down her soot-stained face. Daniel's expression softened further. "You don't need words for me to understand." He glanced at the ruins of the house. "This your home?" Another nod. "Anyone else?" His voice gentled further, already knowing the answer. Hannah's face crumpled as she shook her head. Daniel removed his duster and carefully wrapped it around her shoulders. "I know there ain't nothing I can say to make this better, but you can't stay here tonight." He hesitated. "My camp's not far. You'd be safe there until morning. Then I can take you wherever you need to go." Hannah clutched the coat around her, considering his offer through the fog of grief. She had nowhere else to go. Her nearest neighbors were 20 miles east, and she had no horse of her own anymore. With trembling fingers, she pointed to herself, then to the horse. "Yes, madam, you can ride. I'll walk alongside." She shook her head vigorously and pantomimed both of them riding. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Chestnut there can carry us both a short way, if you're certain." Hannah nodded, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. Daniel helped her to her feet and guided her to his horse. With gentle hands, he lifted her into the saddle before mounting behind her. He kept a respectful distance between their bodies, his arms reaching around her only to hold the reins. "My camp's just beyond that ridge," he said, pointing to a low hill perhaps a mile distant. "You rest now if you can, I've got you." Hannah didn't remember closing her eyes, but she must have dozed, for the next thing she knew, Daniel was carefully helping her down from the horse. A small campfire flickered in a ring of stones, illuminating a modest campsite with a bedroll and saddle bags. "It ain't much," he said apologetically, "but the fire's warm and I've coffee in the pot." He guided her to sit on a fallen log near the fire, then busied himself pouring coffee into a tin cup. When he handed it to her, their fingers brushed, and Hannah felt something stir beneath her grief, a flicker of human connection when she thought all such feelings had burned away with her family. "I'm sorry about your folks," Daniel said, settling across from her. "Fire's a terrible way to go." Hannah's eyes widened. She hadn't told him it was her parents who'd perished. Daniel nodded toward her hands. "You're wearing a wedding band, but it ain't yours." He pointed to how the simple gold band sat loose on her right hand. "Too big for your finger, and ladies generally wear them on the left. Figured it must be your mama's." Hannah clutched the ring reflexively. Her mother had given it to her that very morning for safekeeping while she worked with lye soap. "Keep it in your pocket today, Hanny," she'd said. "Wouldn't want it slipping off in the washtub." "I'm a tracker by trade," Daniel explained, misreading her surprise. Noticing things becomes second nature after a while. He stirred the fire with a stick. "Been working for the railroad, scouting routes and keeping an eye out for trouble." Hannah sipped the coffee, its bitter warmth a small comfort. She wanted to thank him, to ask questions, to speak at all, but her voice remained stubbornly absent. "Don't you worry about talking," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "Voice will come back in time. For now, just rest." Morning's soon enough to figure what's next. He offered her his bedroll, insisting he was fine with just his saddle for a pillow. Hannah was too exhausted to argue. The moment she lay down, wrapped in his duster and a woolen blanket that smelled of horse and leather and pine smoke, exhaustion claimed her. She dreamed of fire and screams and running without moving. When she jolted awake in the pre-dawn chill, she found Daniel already up, cooking something over the rekindled fire. "Morning," he said quietly. "Bacon and beans ain't much of a breakfast, but it'll keep your strength up." Hannah nodded gratefully and tried her voice. All that emerged was a painful croak. "Give it time," Daniel advised, passing her a plate. "Body's got its own way of healing." As they ate in companionable silence, Hannah's mind raced with the impossible decisions before her. She had no family left to turn to. The modest savings her parents had kept were now ash. She knew how to cook, clean, and tend a garden, but such skills wouldn't keep a roof over her head. Daniel seemed to sense her turmoil. "Sweetwater's about a day's ride from here," he said. "I know the sheriff there, decent man. He might know of work for you, or at least somewhere you could stay for a spell." Hannah nodded gratefully. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was something to hold onto in the wreckage of her life. They broke camp efficiently, Hannah helping despite Daniel's protests that she should rest. Within an hour they were on the trail, Hannah perched before Daniel on Chestnut's broad back. She couldn't help but be aware of his solid presence behind her, his arms a careful bracket around her body as he held the reins. The day warmed quickly, the late June sun climbing high in a cloudless sky. Daniel kept up a gentle monologue, pointing out landmarks or sharing brief stories of his travels. Hannah found his voice soothing, a lifeline to cling to as her grief threatened to pull her under. "That creek there," he said, nodding toward a ribbon of green cutting through the brown landscape, "saved my hide 3 summers back. Got caught in a dust storm, couldn't see my hand in front of my face. Chestnut here found the water. Horses have better sense than people most days." Hannah managed a small smile at that, which Daniel caught from his vantage point. "There it is," he said softly. "Wasn't sure I'd see that today." Hannah felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the sun. She'd known Daniel Yates less than a day, yet already he seemed to read her as easily as a book. They stopped at midday to rest the horse and eat a simple meal of jerky and hardtack. Hannah tried her voice again, managing a whispered thank you that hurt her throat but brought a smile to Daniel's face. "You're welcome, Miss Lawson." He'd learned her surname from the charred mailbox still standing at the edge of her family's property. As they continued their journey, Hannah found herself leaning back against Daniel's chest, her initial wariness giving way to the simple human need for contact and comfort. If he noticed, he made no comment, treating her with the same gentle respect he'd shown from the first moment. Late afternoon found them crossing a wide expanse of prairie, the monotony broken only by the occasional scrub bush or rocky outcropping. Daniel had fallen silent, his attention seemingly focused on the horizon. Hannah sensed the change in his posture before she heard him mutter a curse under his breath. "Riders," he said tersely. "3 of them coming fast." Hannah stiffened, following his gaze to where 3 mounted figures approached, dust billowing behind them. "Might be nothing," Daniel said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But I don't like the look of their hurry." He urged Chestnut into a canter, angling away from the rider's path, but it soon became clear they were being pursued. The distant figures changed course to match their own. "Hang on," Daniel murmured, and Hannah clutched the saddle horn as he pressed Chestnut into a gallop. The horse responded gamely, but carrying double weight, he couldn't match the speed of their pursuers. Within minutes, the three riders had closed the gap, forming a semicircle that forced Daniel to rein in. "Well, well," drawled the center rider, a sallow-faced man with a patchy beard and cold eyes. "What do we have here?" "Just passing through," Daniel replied evenly, though Hannah felt the tension in his body. "Heading to Sweetwater." "That's so." The man's gaze slid to Hannah, lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. "Your wife don't look too happy about the company." "She ain't my wife and we don't want trouble," Daniel said, his voice hardening. "Just let us pass." The man to the left spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground. "Reckon that depends on what you're carrying. Times is hard. Might be you could spare something for fellow travelers." Hannah felt Daniel's slight shift as he positioned himself more firmly between her and the strangers. His right hand rested casually near his holster. "Like I said, we don't want trouble." Daniel's voice remained steady, "But we don't have anything worth taking." The leader's laugh held no humor. "Now that ain't neighborly. Everyone's got something worth taking." His hand moved to his own gun. "That's a fine horse you got, and your lady friend there," he never finished the sentence. Daniel's draw was lightning fast, his shot catching the man in the shoulder before he could clear his holster. The injured man howled in pain as his horse reared in panic. "Next one won't be a warning," Daniel called out, his gun now trained on the second man. "Back off and ride away." For a tense moment, Hannah thought the other two would fight, then the third man raised his hands. "Easy now. Jed there gets foolish notions sometimes. We don't mean no real harm." "Then take him and go," Daniel ordered, "and don't follow us." The men reluctantly complied, helping their wounded companion onto his horse. They retreated, the injured man's curses fading as they rode away. Daniel watched them until they were distant specks on the horizon. Only then did he holster his weapon and urge Chestnut forward again. "I'm sorry you had to see that," he said quietly, "but some men only understand one language out here." Hannah nodded, her heart still racing. She reached back to briefly squeeze his arm in silent thanks. The simple gesture seemed to surprise him. "We should keep moving," he said after a moment. "They might think better of letting us go once Jed stops bleeding and starts thinking about revenge." They rode hard for another hour, pushing poor Chestnut nearly to his limits. When they finally stopped at a small copse of trees near a stream, the horse was lathered with sweat. "He needs rest," Daniel said, helping Hannah down, "and so do you. We'll camp here tonight and reach Sweetwater by midday tomorrow." As Daniel tended to Chestnut, Hannah gathered wood for a fire, grateful for the simple task to occupy her hands and mind. The confrontation with the riders had shaken her, reminding her just how vulnerable she was in this harsh land. When Daniel returned from the stream, leading a refreshed Chestnut, he found Hannah sitting by a neatly built fire, her arms wrapped around her knees. "You've done this before," he observed, nodding toward the fire. Hannah nodded, then reached for a stick. She scratched in the dirt, ranch girl. Daniel smiled. "That explains it. Most town ladies wouldn't know how to start a fire without matches." He set about unpacking their meager supplies. "My ma was like you. Could outride and outshoot most men, including my pa. He used to say she was made of whipcord and wildfire." Hannah's curiosity must have shown on her face, for Daniel continued as he prepared their simple meal. "They had a small spread in Colorado. Wasn't much, but it was home. Lost them both to typhoid when I was 16. Been on my own since." Hannah's heart ached for the teenage boy he had been, facing the same devastating loss she now confronted. On impulse, she reached out and touched his hand, their eyes meeting in shared understanding. "It gets better," he said softly. "Not gone, never gone, but better with time." That night, as they sat by the fire after eating, Hannah found her voice returning in painful whispers. The first words she managed were, "Thank you, Daniel." His smile in response warmed her more than the flames. "You're welcome, Hannah." The simple exchange of names felt significant somehow, an acknowledgement of the strange bond forming between them. "Will you tell me about them?" Daniel asked gently. "Your folks, sometimes it helps to speak their names." Hannah's throat tightened, but she nodded. In halting whispers, she told him about Thomas and Mary Lawson, who had come west from Pennsylvania with dreams of building a cattle ranch. How her father could charm birds from trees with his stories, and her mother could grow roses in the most unforgiving soil. How they had taught her to be strong and kind in equal measure. "They sound like good people," Daniel said when she finally fell silent, "the kind this country needs more of." "Yes," Hannah whispered, wiping away tears. "They were." She looked up to find Daniel studying her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. In the firelight, his features seemed softer, the hard lines of his face gentled. "You should rest," he said after a moment. "Tomorrow will be another long day." Hannah nodded, suddenly aware of her bone-deep exhaustion. As she settled into the bedroll, Daniel remained by the fire, a silent sentinel against the darkness. "Daniel," her voice was barely audible. "Yes. What will happen in Sweetwater?" He was quiet for so long that Hannah thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "Sheriff Hayes might know of a position housekeeping at the hotel, perhaps, or helping at the general store. It's a small town, but decent enough." It wasn't what Hannah had asked, not really, but she accepted it with a nod. What she'd wanted to know was what would happen to this fragile connection between them when civilization intruded once more. Sleep claimed her before she could find the words or courage to ask. Morning dawned clear and hot, the relentless Wyoming sun already burning away the night's chill as they broke camp. Hannah's voice was stronger, though still raspy and painful after extended use. They traveled in comfortable silence for the first hour, the rhythmic plod of chestnuts hooves a soothing backdrop to Hannah's thoughts. "There," Daniel said eventually, pointing to a smudge on the horizon. "Sweetwater." Hannah felt a curious mix of relief and apprehension. Part of her longed for the security of walls and people after the vulnerable exposure of the trail. Another part dreaded the coming separation from the man, whose steady presence had become her anchor in a world turned upside down. "Sheriff Hayes is a good man," Daniel told her as they drew closer to the town. "Fought with my pa in the war, he'll help you find your feet." Hannah nodded, her hands tightening on the saddle horn. "And you?" she asked, the question she'd been avoiding finally finding voice. Daniel was quiet for several strides. "I've got business with the railroad," he said finally, "scouting work that'll take me north for a spell." "I see." Hannah tried to keep the disappointment from her voice. "Hannah." Something in his tone made her turn to look at him. "If there was any other way, if I didn't have obligations." "I understand," she said quickly, embarrassed by her own presumption. "You've already done more than enough." "No," he said firmly, "I haven't, but I gave my word, and a man out here is only as good as that." They rode the remaining distance in silence, the growing outline of Sweetwater both welcome and foreboding. As they entered the main street, Hannah was struck by how normal it all seemed, people going about their business, shops open, life continuing as if her world hadn't ended just 2 days ago. Daniel guided them to a modest building with sheriff painted on a weathered sign. He dismounted first, then helped Hannah down, his hands lingering briefly at her waist. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Hannah nodded, smoothing her dust-covered skirts in a futile attempt at presentability. Sheriff Hayes proved to be exactly as Daniel had described a good man, his weathered face creasing with concern as Daniel related Hannah's circumstances. The older man offered immediate assistance, mentioning that Mrs. Potter at the boarding house was looking for help and would likely provide room and board along with modest wages. "It's honest work," Sheriff Hayes assured her, "and Mrs. Potter's fair, if a bit particular about how things are done." Hannah expressed her gratitude, her voice still rough but functional. Through it all, she was acutely aware of Daniel's presence at her side and of the moment fast approaching when he would no longer be there. "I'll walk you to the boarding house," Daniel offered when they'd concluded their business with the sheriff. "Make sure you're settled before I head out." Mrs. Potter turned out to be a bustling widow in her 50s with sharp eyes and a surprisingly kind smile. She welcomed Hannah with brisk efficiency, showing her to a small but clean room at the back of the house. "Meals are at 6, noon, and 6, she informed Hannah. "Laundry's done on Mondays, cleaning on Tuesdays through Fridays. Saturdays you'll help me bake, and Sundays are for church and rest." She eyed Hannah's disheveled state. "For today, though, you get yourself cleaned up and rested. You look dead on your feet, child." Left alone with Daniel for a moment while Mrs. Potter went to fetch clean linens, Hannah found herself at a loss for words. How did one thank a man for saving not just your life but your soul? "For being the one solid thing in a world reduced to ashes, I should go," Daniel said, his hat in his hands. "Train north leaves in an hour," Hannah nodded, fighting back tears. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to," his eyes held hers. "I only did what any decent man would do." "No," Hannah said with sudden fierceness. "Not any man, you." She stepped closer, her heart pounding. "Will you come back after your work is done?" Daniel's expression softened. "Hannah." He reached out, his calloused fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "I can't promise when. The railroad work could take months." "I'll be here," she said simply. For a moment she thought he might kiss her. Instead, he took her hand and pressed something into it, a small wooden carving of a bird in flight. "Made it last night while you slept," he explained. "Something to remember that there's freedom after loss." Hannah closed her fingers around the small token, too moved to speak. "I'll come back when I can," Daniel said finally. "That's the best promise I can make. It had to be enough." Hannah watched from the boarding house porch as he mounted Chestnut and rode away, the straight line of his back gradually diminishing until he was swallowed by the dust and distance of the open prairie. Life in Sweetwater developed a rhythm that Hannah clung to in the absence of all else familiar. Mrs. Potter proved a fair employer, if exacting in her standards. The work was hard but uncomplicated cleaning, cooking, mending, leaving Hannah's mind free to process her grief in small, manageable pieces. Her voice returned fully within a week, though she remained quieter than before, speaking only when necessary. The townsfolk treated her with the cautious kindness reserved for those touched by tragedy, offering work when they could, alterations from Mrs. Davis at the dress shop, assistance with the ledgers at Mr. Howard's general store when his eyes were troubling him. And through it all, she waited for Daniel. June gave way to July, then August. The heat was oppressive, the work constant, but Hannah found a kind of healing in the simple act of continuing. She wrote to her parents' only living relative, an elderly aunt in St. Louis, informing her of their passing. The response came weeks later, a brief note expressing condolences and offering neither assistance nor invitation. Hannah tucked the letter away and focused on building her new life. She saved every penny she could, tucking the coins into an old coffee tin beneath a loose floorboard in her room. Each night, she held Daniel's carved bird and whispered a prayer for his safety before sleep claimed her. September brought the first hints of autumn, the brutal heat giving way to crisp mornings and golden afternoons. Hannah had just finished hanging laundry in the yard behind the boarding house when Mrs. Potter called her name. "There's someone asking for you at the front," the older woman said, a curious look in her eyes. "A gentleman caller." Hannah's heart leapt, her hands fumbling with the clothespin she held. She smoothed her apron with trembling fingers and hurried through the house, trying to temper her hopes. It could be anyone, Mr. Howard with more ledger work, or Sheriff Hayes with news of her property. But it was Daniel who stood on the porch, hat in hand, looking somehow both the same and different. His clothes were newer, his face clean-shaven, but his eyes, those storm cloud eyes, were unchanged as they fixed on her with an intensity that stole her breath. "Hannah," he said simply. She stepped forward, hardly aware of moving. "You came back." A smile touched his lips. "I promised I would." They stood there, separated by mere feet but held apart by the weight of all that had happened in the months between. Then Daniel closed the distance in 2 strides, his hands gentle as they framed her face. "Not a day passed that I didn't think of you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not one." Hannah's eyes filled with tears. "I kept your bird close," she whispered. "It helped me remember there was still good in the world." His thumb brushed a tear from her cheek. "I finished my contract with the railroad," he said. "Came straight here after. To stay?" Hannah hardly dared ask. "That depends." Daniel's gaze never left hers. "On whether there's a reason to." "There is," Hannah said without hesitation. "There is, Daniel." What might have happened next was interrupted by Mrs. Potter clearing her throat pointedly from the doorway. "Miss Lawson, perhaps you'd like to show Mr. Yates the garden. It's quite pleasant this time of day." Hannah blushed, suddenly aware of how their intimate moment must appear. "Yes, thank you, Mrs. Potter." She looked to Daniel. "Will you walk with me?" The boarding house garden was little more than a small plot with a few hardy flowers and a bench beneath an ancient cottonwood, but it offered privacy from curious eyes. As they settled on the bench, Hannah noticed a slight stiffness in Daniel's movements. "You're hurt," she said, concern sharpening her voice. Daniel shook his head dismissively. "Old injury acting up, nothing serious." Hannah wasn't convinced, but let it pass. There were more pressing matters. "Tell me about your months away," she urged. "Where did the railroad take you?" Daniel described his journey north, mapping potential routes through the territories, dealing with the challenges of terrain and occasionally hostile locals. Hannah listened, captivated not just by the tales, but by the animation in his face as he told them. "But enough about my wanderings," he said finally. "Tell me about you. How have you fared in Sweetwater?" Hannah told him of her gradual integration into the small community, the work she'd found, the slow healing of her heart. "It's not the life I expected," she concluded. "But I'm finding my way through it." "You're remarkable," Daniel said, his admiration evident. "Many would have broken under such loss." "I nearly did," Hannah admitted. "That first night before you found me." She shook her head. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along when you did." Daniel took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I think you're stronger than you know." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the late afternoon sun filtering through the cottonwood leaves above them. Finally, Daniel spoke again, his voice careful. "I've been thinking a lot these past months, Hannah, about what I want for my future." He turned to face her fully. "I'm 32 years old, been roaming since I was 16. Think maybe it's time I put down roots somewhere." Hannah's heart quickened. "Sweetwater seems as good a place as any," she offered, trying to keep her voice casual. "It does." His eyes held hers. "Especially with you in it." Before Hannah could respond, Daniel continued, the words coming in a rush now. "I know it's soon. We've barely spent more than days in each other's company, but I feel like I've known you a lifetime, Hannah Lawson. When I'm with you, everything makes sense in a way it never has before." Hannah felt tears gathering again, but they were different from the tears of grief she'd shed so often in recent months. These were tears of a hope she'd thought forever extinguished. "I feel it too," she whispered. "From that first night when you said I didn't need words for you to understand. No one's ever seen me the way you do, Daniel." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "I can't offer much. I've saved some money from the railroad work enough to make a start somewhere, maybe a small place outside of town." "It wouldn't be easy, but I don't need easy," Hannah interrupted. "I just need you." The simple declaration hung between them for a heartbeat before Daniel leaned forward, his lips meeting hers in a gentle kiss that deepened as Hannah responded with all the emotion she'd held in check for so long. When they finally parted, both breathless, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Hannah Lawson. Have since that night by the fire when you told me about your parents and I saw your heart fully for the first time." "I love you too," Hannah replied, the words feeling simultaneously momentous and as natural as breathing. "Even when I wasn't sure you'd come back, I loved you. Wild horses couldn't have kept me away," Daniel assured her. Or railroad bosses, for that matter. Hannah laughed, the sound surprising her with its lightness. How long had it been since she'd truly laughed? Their conversation shifted to practical matters then, where they might live, what work Daniel might find. He had skills as a tracker and knew horses well enough to consider working at the livery stable until they could save enough for a place of their own. And your land, he added. We should see what can be salvaged. The property itself is still yours, even if the house is gone. The thought of returning to the scene of so much pain made Hannah's chest tighten, but Daniel's steady presence beside her made it seem possible. I'd like that, she said. Not to live there, not right away, but to visit to say a proper goodbye. As the sun began to set, they reluctantly returned to the boarding house. Mrs. Potter was waiting in the parlor, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. Mr. Yates, she said directly, I presume you'll be staying in town a while. Yes, madam, Daniel replied. I'm looking to settle here permanently. Mrs. Potter's eyebrows rose. I see. She glanced between them. And I suppose you'll be calling on Miss Lawson regularly. With your permission, Daniel said respectfully. And hers. The older woman's face softened. Hannah's become like family these past months. I'd not see her hurt. Nor would I, madam, Daniel assured her. I intend to do right by her in every way. Mrs. Potter nodded, apparently satisfied. Well then, you're welcome for dinner this evening, Mr. Yates. And perhaps Hannah might have tomorrow afternoon free to show you around town properly. Her stern expression gave way to a small smile. Provided you both remember the proprieties, of course. Of course, Hannah agreed, exchanging a private look with Daniel that set her heart racing anew. That dinner was the first of many. True to his word, Daniel found work at the livery stable, his knowledge of horses quickly making him invaluable to the owner. He took a room at the men's boarding house across town, and each evening after work, he would call on Hannah at Mrs. Potter's. Their courtship progressed with a speed that might have scandalized in more settled communities, but which seemed perfectly natural to them both. They had already weathered the kind of crisis together that most couples never faced in decades of marriage. The bonds forged in such fire were not easily broken or denied. A month after his return, on a crisp October afternoon, Daniel took Hannah to see a small cabin on the outskirts of town. It sat on 2 acres of land, with a creek running along one boundary and enough space for a garden and perhaps a few animals. It needs work, Daniel acknowledged as they stood in the single main room. But the bones are good. Owners heading to California wants to sell quick. Hannah walked to the window, looking out at the land that sloped gently toward the creek. She could envision it in spring, green with new growth. A home. Their home. It's perfect, she said, turning back to find Daniel watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. He crossed to her in 3 strides, taking both her hands in his. Marry me, Hannah, he said without preamble. Not someday, not eventually, soon, next week if Reverend Taylor is willing. Hannah's heart soared. Yes, she answered without hesitation. Yes, Daniel. They were married on the last Saturday in October, with the cottonwoods along the creek turning gold and the air crisp with autumn. Mrs. Potter insisted the ceremony take place in the boarding house parlor, which she decorated with late blooming chrysanthemums and ribbons saved from Christmases past. Sheriff Hayes stood as Daniel's best man, and Mrs. Potter herself gave the bride away. Hannah wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Davis had helped her make, with lace at the collar that had once belonged to her mother salvaged from the trunk Hannah had taken to town on that fateful day. When Reverend Taylor pronounced them man and wife, Daniel kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to the eyes of even the most stoic townsfolk present. The small reception afterward was filled with warmth and genuine well-wishes from the community that had taken Hannah in during her darkest days. As twilight fell, Daniel drove a borrowed wagon to their new home, Hannah seated beside him, her hand tucked securely in his. Welcome home, Mrs. Yates, he said as he carried her over the threshold of the cabin they had spent weeks preparing together. Inside, A fire crackled in the hearth, casting golden light over the simple furnishings, a table and chairs Daniel had made himself, a bed with a quilt pieced by Mrs. Potter and the other boarding house ladies, shelves holding the few possessions they had each brought to their union. On the mantel stood the carved bird Daniel had given her, now joined by others he had made during the long evenings of their courtship, a pair of horses running side by side, a fox with a clever expression, a delicate rose. Each one a testament to his hand's ability to create beauty from the roughest materials. "It's not much," Daniel said, echoing his words from that first night by the campfire, "but it's ours." Hannah turned in his arms, lifting her face to his. "It's everything," she corrected him. "Because you're here." Later, as moonlight streamed through the cabin's single window, Hannah lay in Daniel's arms, marveling at how life could change so completely in the span of a few months. From devastating loss to overwhelming love. From silence to understanding deeper than words could express. "What are you thinking?" Daniel murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "That I never expected to be happy again," she answered honestly. "After the fire, I thought that part of my life was over forever." Daniel pulled her closer. "I know that feeling. Carried it with me for years after losing my parents." "What changed it? For you?" Hannah propped herself up to see his face in the dim light. His smile was tender as he brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "You did, finding you that night, seeing your strength even in the depths of such pain. It healed something in me I didn't know was still broken." Hannah laid her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Do you think they know, my parents, that I found happiness again?" "I do," Daniel said with quiet certainty. "I believe they led me to you that night. I wasn't even supposed to be on that trail, had planned to take the northern route to Sweetwater. Changed my mind at the last minute, for no reason I could name." The thought was comforting that perhaps her parents' love continued to guide her even now. Hannah closed her eyes, letting peace settle over her like a blanket. "I love you, Daniel Yates," she whispered, his arms tightened around her. "And I love you, Hannah Yates, every day for the rest of our lives." The months that followed were not without challenges. Winter came early that year, blanketing their small homestead in snow and testing their preparations. The roof leaked during the first heavy storm, sending them scrambling with buckets and pans. The stove smoked abominably until Daniel figured out the problem with the chimney. But through it all, they faced each challenge together, their bond strengthening with every obstacle overcome. By spring, when the first green shoots pushed through the soil of Hannah's carefully tended garden, they had truly made the cabin their home. Daniel's skill with horses had earned him a promotion at the livery, while Hannah had started taking in mending and alterations, her deft needle bringing in welcome additional income. They saved diligently, dreaming of expanding their modest holdings someday. In late April, as wildflowers carpeted the prairie in a riot of color, Hannah shared news that brought tears of joy to Daniel's eyes. They would welcome a child before the year was out. "A family," he said in wonder, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach. "Our family, Hannah." Standing there in the doorway of their home, with the man she loved and the promise of new life growing within her, Hannah thought of that terrible night nearly a year before, when she had lost her voice from crying out her grief. How impossible it would have seemed then to imagine this moment, this happiness. Yet here she was, her heart full, her future stretching bright before her like the endless Wyoming sky. All because a kind-hearted cowboy had stopped to help a stranger in distress, understanding what she needed even when she had no words to ask. "Our family," Hannah agreed, covering his hand with her own. "The one we've chosen, the one we're building, together." As the sun set over their small piece of the frontier, painting the land in hues of gold and amber, Daniel drew her close, his kiss a promise that needed no words to be understood, that whatever came, they would face it as one. In this harsh, beautiful land where only the strongest survived, they had found in each other not just survival, but a chance to truly live. And for Hannah Lawson Yates, who had once thought all hope lost in ash and flame, that was the greatest miracle of all.